Hello all, welcome to your final module. We made it. We are in module 7. In this quick video, I'm going over the test review as I promised you guys for the test 2. Again, it's 70 minutes, it has 20 questions, and it covers modules 4 through 7. So let's get right into it so you guys are ready and prepared. What we talked about is interpretation education, and I talked about that interpretation is so important in nature-based tourism, right? It is one of the key elements of ecotourism, but really in any kind of nature-based tourism, it is super important. It's how we get the visitor to really care about the resource, to learn about the resource, and it's more than education, right? We talked about that interpretation really can be anywhere. It can be in a visitor center, it can be on a brochure, it can be on a website, it can be through signs on a trail. So you guys have probably gone on trails in nature and you've seen like different signs. It could be any of that, right? Interpretation is usually thematic. So there's usually a theme. So for example, why do we have crocodiles, or why, those kinds of things. And then there's answers and questions and displays based on that. And so the other key element besides there being a theme is that it really should invoke the interest of the visitor, where the tourist wants to learn more. They want to kind of get hooked and learn more about it, right? So look at that in that module and the page that I created on education and interpretation so that you guys can really see all the examples and see what it's like. I also posted a really cool video about it that some people posted on YouTube. We also talked about some management strategies. Among them are site hardening. Again, site hardening, if it asks on the test, is anything that we do to the site to increase its carrying capacity, right? So we gave the example of a mooring ball on the coral reef, which allows more dive boats to come in without damaging the reef by throwing the anchor, right? We talked about that on a like the Everglades on a grasslands. It could be a boardwalk so that more people can walk without trampling. Those kinds of things that we can do to the site to harden it so that, again, more people can fit on it, increasing the carrying capacity. One of the downsides that we talked about with site hardening, again, is that while, the site hardened site might actually be able to take, 5,000 people on a boardwalk or 200 boats on a mooring ball, the environment around it might not, right? So the fish are still gonna get impacted by the divers. Likewise, on a boardwalk, animals around it might still get impacted. So we have to keep that in mind, right? So again, site hardening, anything we do to increase carrying capacity, right? A mooring ball, I said, is an example of site hardening. We talked about site softening as well. So site softening is anything that we do to rebuild the resource if there was impact. So we might replant things, we might regrow coral, right? Coral restoration, we talked about that in the keys. So that is all examples of site softening. We also talked about another important management strategy that we can use in nature-based tourism, which is zoning. And zoning, again, is really important. One, to decrease visitor conflict, right? Also to decrease impacts. So zoning means that we could have a no-take zone, we could have a zone where there's only research being done or absolutely no human contact. We could have a zone that is good for, motorized vehicles, right? So it allows for a degree of protection and it helps avoid conflict. So just remember that. Then we talked about carrying capacity and limits of acceptable change, right? So carrying capacity, again, had to do with how many people can fit in a certain place without there being any kind of impacts, right? The concept was actually first used in livestock management because people were figuring out that if you put one more cow on a grass pasture, all of a sudden it gets that point where all of a sudden the grass turns gray, right? Or brown, and we don't know why, because that one extra cow just made all the difference, right? And so it aims to quantitatively measure how many people, how much use is too much use, right? It has a biological component, but it also has a social component. We talked about that social component, right? People could feel crowded, right, in nature. So we can feel crowded on a trail. We talked about all of those things. How could we feel crowded, right? If there's users who have different motives than us, different group sizes, and so on, right? Limits of acceptable change, on the other hand, was a management framework that has 9 steps, right? It is a multi-step process. It looks at a baseline and then monitoring the resource continuously to figure out where are those changes happening, how much change is happening, and how do we then manage it based on what is actually going on, what are the changes that are going on, right? So again, it requires monitoring the resource, setting a baseline, and it's a way to manage impacts in tourism on the resource, right? With that monitoring and also with the baseline, we talked about this whole concept of shifting baselines that I want you guys to remember, right? And we talked about that sometimes we don't even know anymore what was actually real, right? So we talked about how coral reefs have changed, how we're starting to accept things as normal when we really shouldn't accept them as normal. So shifting baselines means that we really don't know what's really pristine or natural anymore. And sometimes we need to put our baseline maybe back, not just in the now, but actually back to what it used to be, right? And I gave the example of some of the state parks in Florida that actually look at what is native plants. Is it plants that are here now? No, actually, it's plants that were here in Florida before the Spanish even arrived, because that is truly native plants in Florida, right? So that's just an example. Some of the management frameworks that we talked about was, of course, limits of acceptable change, but we also talked about the visitor experience framework, VERB, right? We talked about VIM, visitor impact management. So just know that these are both frameworks that are really similar, all of them. They're all able to be used in nature-based tourism, right? Then we talked about again, monitoring, so just know what that is, right? That we basically look at how the resource changes. We talked about what a baseline is. It's where we start measuring change from. Site softening, again, we talked about that it's anything to help the resource regrow where there was impact, right? And we talked about that interpretation is very important. We also talked about that education in nature-based tourism is important, not just in the form of interpretation, but also because it really does change visitor behavior. And I gave you guys the example of if we do a dive briefing, right, and we do just a little bit of education of coral reefs and what they are and how they grow, it actually changes visitor behavior, and they actually are not impacting the resource as much. So just remember that education is a soft intervention strategy. It's not saying you cannot do this, right? But it's a soft way of changing visitor behavior and having less impact. So just remember that. We also talked about that one of the first management strategies before we do anything is actually, if there isn't a protected area yet, to establish the area as a protected area, right? And that is so important. It's important so that we can have the wildlife, that tourism can function in the future, that we have a resource, that we actually have an attraction in the future, right? We also know that those protected areas really work. There are studies after studies after studies that show that fish are bigger in marine protected areas, that populations are coming back, right? So protected areas work. They really do, and that's an amazing thing, and they're good for tourism. So just remember that is one of the first steps. If we want to have nature-based tourism, we need to have a protected area so that we can actually have a tourism product in the future. We also talked about some of the impacts of tourism in nature on the local communities that live in those natural areas, right? And we talked about that we really need to involve the local community. One, because the community actually needs to profit, right, and get benefits from tourism, but also because the community really helps to conserve the resource. If we do not include the community, we cannot effectively protect the resources, right? We talked about some of the other impacts on local communities. Just look at that module again. We talked about leakage, which is money leaking out of the local region going back abroad, right? We talked about commodification. We talked about resentment maybe from the local community. We talked about that it could lead to inflation, right? We talked about that the local community could change based on staging their culture, right? Staged authenticity and so on, right? We also talked about many ways of how we can limit the use of a resource. So we could charge an entrance fee, we could require special skills or certification, we could require permits to go somewhere, right? So those are all ways of limiting access to a resource if we need to diminish access to the resource, because that is how we need to manage. So just remember that. We also talked about the recreation opportunity spectrum. And again, that was a management framework that says that within a certain area, right, if we want to offer a good quality experience for the tourist, there should be different opportunities to experience different things, right? And so I gave you guys the example of a campsite. So if somebody wants to experience nature, but they don't want to be fully in nature, they want to have paved roads, and they want to have, maybe just a social gathering with the bigger family, and camp in their RV, there should be an opportunity for that, right? So that would be an example of the opportunity class in the recreation opportunity spectrum of a somewhat rural, right, paved roads. And then at the same time, there should also be opportunities for somebody who wants solitude, who wants connection with nature and no other people, right? Should be like maybe a primitive campsite where you go in the backcountry, right, and you go camping there. So just remember that. So it ensures that visitors with different motives can actually go and enjoy the same park. It establishes different opportunity classes based on how it's managed, the setting, right? Like I talked about, is it paved or not? How many people? Is it managed or not, right? And so on. And there are 6 different classes, so just remember that. And I think that's basically it for the review of the test. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Again, I loved having you guys in class. If there's anything, please reach out to me. Stay in touch afterwards. Again, good luck on your test. You guys will do great, and I will speak to you guys later. Ciao.